Okay, so we're in the middle of chapter 4, as mentioned before. Sorry about that. Never called you Sorrel before. It's weird. Where'd that come from? I just possessed for a moment. Right. We're blaming everything on the Sufdani overnight. So, chapter 1 gave us the basic questions that got the Alter Rebbe started on this whole process. Um, what exactly does it mean to be righteous? What exactly does it mean to be a Benoni? Not a tzaddik, not a rasha. And then he introduced in chapter 1 the nefesh, the soul, the animal soul, and how it functions. And then he introduced to us in chapter 2 the godly soul and how it functions. And then in chapter 3 he introduced to us the midot, or the attributes of the soul, the neshama, the 3 levels of the sechel, of the intellect, and the 7 emotional attributes. And then in chapter 4, the first half of chapter 4, he introduced us to another concept about the function of the neshama, which is that in addition to the ideas and the feelings of a soul, of a person, in this case the godly soul, there are also what he refers to as the 3 livushim, the 3 garments of the soul. The 3 garments of the soul are thought, speech, and action. So when, for example, you're speaking words of Torah, or if you're doing an act of a mitzvah, then that is a garment in which the godly soul is dressed up, is enclosed in the thought and the speech and the action, which are the garments of the neshama. That's what we said in the first half of the chapter. Then he said that what's interesting about these libushei hanefesh, the garments of the soul, is that although we're saying that they're just the garments of the soul, they're not the soul itself. The intellect, the sechel, and the midot, the emotions, those are actually the soul itself. Thought, speech, and action are just the expressions, the garments of the soul. Like when you put on a uniform, you're expressing a certain authority, or when you wear certain types of clothing, you express certain moods. So it's an expression. Nevertheless, he says the garments, the levushei hanefesh, actually have an infinitely greater advantage, in a certain sense, than the midot, or the seichel, the intellect, or the emotions of the neshama. What is that advantage? He says the advantage is, that's what we're going to be discussing now, is that the seichel and the midot, the intellect and the emotions of the neshama, no matter how successful they are, no matter how much they accomplish, for example, the intellect, human intellect, the intellect of a created being cannot fathom, can't understand the true essence of the creator. It's just not possible. The mind of a creation can't really understand the creator. So no matter how much you understand, no matter how successful you are in relating to or understanding Hashem, it's only a tiny little. On the other hand, when you do a mitzvah or when you study Torah, you're actually embracing Hashem himself, because Hashem, like you said from the Rambam, God and his will, God and his intellect can't be separated. It's the same thing. So if Hashem puts his intellect into the Torah and you study Torah, you're literally you're speaking Hashem's words. If you do a mitzvah, if you do Hashem's will, you're literally embracing Hashem much more than if you try to understand it. So on the one hand, understanding and feeling is a great accomplishment, but no matter how much you accomplish there, you're always limited. On the other hand, doing or speaking, even if it's not really true to who you are, even if you don't feel it, even if you don't understand it. So in that sense, it's lower, but on the other hand, it's much higher because you're actually reaching Hashem Himself, not just some distant expression of Him. So that's where we're in the middle of that conversation. So we got a little farther into the chapter, but I think we'll go back a few lines. We'll go back to where I'll just run very quickly through the part that we did already. We'll start with the words Vihine Shalosha Levushim Elu. These three garments. If you have that, I don't know which translation you're reading, which page you're on. We have all these different books, so I really can't tell you. The black one, it's on page 13. Section 3. It's about a third of the way through the chapter. A paragraph starts with, and now the three garments of these three garments of the soul. You have it? Mm-hmm. If you pass me that book, I'll try to find it. That one book that no one's using. V'hinei shalosh levushim elu. It's in this book. It's on page 81, bottom of the page. Moshe, what page is it? 13. These three garments of the Torah and its mitzvahs. In other words, the garments of the soul, of the neshama, with which we do or speak about or think the words of the Torah or perform the mitzvahs. Although they are referred to as garments of the neshama, like I said before, that seems to suggest that they're not really as special as the neshama itself. They're only garments to the nefesh. So it's probably, it seems it would be lower then. Nevertheless, gova vegodla malasam le'en ketz. Their greatness is greater and higher, to infinitely higher, le'en ketz v'tov, to no end. Al malas nefesh ruach neshama atzman, over the nefesh and the ruach and the neshama themselves. Like the Zohar says, the Araisa b'kuchabricha kulachad. God and His Torah are literally one. You can't separate them. Pirush, this means the Araisa hi chachmasa retina shel Hakadosh Baruch Hu, that the Torah is God's intellect and God's will, God's chokhmah and God's ratzon. Ve'Hakadosh Baruch Hu b'chvoide ba'atzmei kul echad, and that Torah and God Himself are literally one. Like we said before, like we mentioned earlier, that God is the knowledge and God is the knower and God is what is known. It's all one thing wrapped up, which is not something that a human mind can really comprehend. So if the Torah and God are completely one, and you engage in Torah, you're connecting to God Himself. And although God is infinite, Ein Sof, and no one can really fathom His greatness. And the Zohar says, no mind can really grasp God. And the same is true with His will or His intellect. Kidiksiv, he brings a few different verses from Torah. Ein cheker l'tvunato, nobody can understand his understanding. That's from Yeshayahu. Uksiv acheker lakatimsa. It says, another pasuk says, if you will try to understand God, will you succeed? That's from Eov. And then it says, Uksiv ki lo machshorotai machshorotechem, my thoughts are not your thoughts. That's from Yeshaya. So all kinds of places in Torah that says, don't even try to understand God. It's not going to happen. You're never going to understand it, because it's impossible for the creation to understand its creator. It's not on the same. It's not in the same. Not just not levels are within one realm. Yeah, it's like completely outside of. Yeah, it's like trying to explain to trying to explain to a blind person what color is. It's not possible. They have no reference for it. There's no but nevertheless, with all of that truth that God is absolutely infinite and not understandable and not comprehensible, nevertheless, it says, in the same place where you find God's greatness, so that's where you find his humility. What does this mean? That means that where you see God's greatness, where God is greatest, where God is most great, that's where he wants to be known. He wants to have a relationship. He wants to be relevant. He wants to be productive and engaging in a relationship and doing something for someone. And God condenses. How would you translate mitzamtzim? Concentrate. Yeah. So this word in Kabbalah is very, very hotly debated. What exactly does it mean that God was mitzamtzim? He concentrated, or he condensed, or he reduced himself. Right. So there are a lot of different explanations or ways of understanding it in Kabbalah language, just like there are different ways of using it in modern language. There's one of the great debates between the Hasidim and the non-Hasidim in the earliest days of the Alter Rebbe and the Gaon Mevilna was whether Tzimtzum, when it says that God was mitzamtzem et atzmo, God condensed himself, whether that means literally or figuratively. Many people believe it's literal because that's what it says. It says that God removed himself from a space in order to create a vacuum, in order to create halal, an empty space in which to create the world. And that was the big debate that the Alter Rebbe was saying, that it's insane to say that it's tzimtzum kipshuto, that God literally removed himself from. Doesn't mean removed. It means that God condensed or concentrated himself into which we'll talk about more as we get into the Tanya much more deeply. But the point is that where you find God's greatness, you also find his humility, that in order to have a relationship, he withdraws his influence so that you can talk to him. If you looked at God and you saw God, you would die of ecstasy. You couldn't have a conversation with God. So God completely covers up his own influence so that you can have a relationship with him. That's his humility. That he does that in the 613 mitzvot of the Torah and all of their halachot, all of the laws of the mitzvahs, Tanakh, and also with all the different combinations of the letters in Tanakh, the written Torah, and also in the different explanations and the stories that you find in the oral Torah, written writings of the sages. All of this is bichdei, in order that every neshama that's in the body of a human being can understand the Torah. That's why God reduces himself, whatever word we're going to use, contracts himself, condenses himself into an expression of himself that can be understood in the Torah by every neshama, every human being with a beating heart. And also to fulfill the mitzvahs, kol ma'ashev shalakayim mehen b'ma'aseh dirach, to fulfill whatever you're able to fulfill with your action and your speech and your thoughts. And through this, and through this, your neshama, with all of its 10 attributes, with its 10 elements of the sechel and its 7 elements of the emotions, can enclose itself, can wrap itself up in pure godliness. In the Gemara and the Talmud, it says that the Torah is compared to water, and it says Ma mayim yordim mimokim gavoya lamokim nomoch, kach haTorah yordim mimokim kvoida. Just like the Torah came down from a high place down to, just like water flows down from a high place to a low place, so too the Torah comes down from its high place, which is the pure will of God, where God and His Torah are God and His and Torah are literally one. And nothing can possibly understand it. And nevertheless, and from there it travels and it comes down through all these different levels, from one level to another, through the whole chain system of the worlds that God created, to the point where it then becomes enclosed in physical matter, physical things, matters of this world. All of the mitzvahs of the Torah involve some physical stuff. Think of a mitzvah that you do without any physical stuff. Shabbos, you do with physical stuff. You eat. One of the mitzvahs of Shabbos. Avas Yisrael. So that's why he says. That's why he says. That's why he's. So that's why he says. Roiv mitzvahs Torah. Most of the mitzvahs of the Torah, kuchulan, which is essentially all of them, vihilchotehen, and all of their halachot. What are the halachas of Avat Yisrael? Avat Yisrael is a feeling. What does halacha say? What do you have to do for Avat Yisrael? Go do him a favor. Bring him a cup of water. You have to do something, which means it has to be physical. That's why he adds the words v'hilchotehen. Even the mitzvahs that are only in your heart or only in your mind, even they have a very physical expression, which means the mitzvahs that you do are physical. And yet you're saying that this physical act is the pure, uncondensed, unreduced desire of Hashem. It is, but even your mind, technically, even thinking is a physical act.
But thoughts are also not.
No, a thought is also a physical act. It's not. You could say it's the spiritual end of a physical being, but it's still within the physical. But the brain is always working. Even if it's not thinking, it's working. Back up a couple of lines. Look at where he said, "V'lama nimshla Torah l'mayim." Why is the Torah referred to as water? V'lachin, I'm sorry. That's why the Torah is compared to water. Why is the Torah compared to water? Why is he saying this here? We get the idea. Why do we need the help of a no, why do we need the help? He's trying to explain to us the concept that Torah comes from a very lofty place, very high place in God's spiritual realms, all the way down to the physical world. Why does he have to give us an example of water flowing from a high place to a low place? We know what it means to go from up there to down here. What is this mashal? What is this? So why is he saying this here? What's it? Yeah, but he's making one specific point here. The one specific point he's making is he's saying that Torah is way up in heaven. It's godly. It's Hashem Himself, and it comes down into a physical world, and that's why Torah nimshal alamayim. How does that help us understand what he's trying to say? You understand? The Alter Rebbe is being very precise, right? You have to keep that in mind when you learn Tanya. The Alter Rebbe is being very precise and very accurate. What does this analogy of the water coming down from a high place to a low place do to help us understand the idea that Torah comes from a high place to a low place? What's it adding to the conversation? He's trying to make us understand this.
They come from up there and we are down here.
So if you look in many Kabbalistic works, the normal analogy for God's revelation or God's energy flow into this world is usually light. Here he's not using the analogy of light. He's using the analogy of water. Why? He's trying to tell you something very specific. He's trying to say that the godliness that we feel in the mitzvah is God himself. That's what the point he's trying to make, right? He's trying to say, when you do a mitzvah, that's greater than what the neshama feels. When the neshama understands God, it only understands a little, some distant, but 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 when we do an act of a mitzvah, you're actually embracing God himself, not like some. That's why the Torah is compared to water, because light, the sun shines its light down here. So when we have a light here, does that mean that the sun is here? No, we're getting a ray from the sun. Torah is compared to water because when water flows from up there to down here, the water that was over there is now here. It's not some extension of the water, a ray of the water. It's the water itself. That's why Torah can't only be compared to light, it also has to be compared to water, because there's a problem with the analogy of light that is not perfect for understanding Torah. So here the Alter Rebbe says, in this context, the Torah is compared to water, not to light. Because what you're getting when you do a mitzvah, what you're getting when you study Torah, what you're getting when you speak the words of tefillah, of prayer, you're literally embracing God. Not an extension, an expression, a ray of light from God, God himself. That's what he's trying to say. That's the advantage of the garments of the soul that makes them greater than the intellect of the soul. The intellect, you can understand God, but how much can your intellect understand the rest? When you do a mitzvah, you literally have God himself. So, religious people who want to meditate, meditating, it's a great thing to do. It doesn't compare. It's infinitely, it's like, what do you say? Le'en ketz v'sof. The greatness of performing a mitzvah is greater, le'en ketz v'sof, absolutely infinitely greater than any kind of accomplishment you can make through meditating, contemplating, understanding. Doing a single act of a mitzvah, infinitely bigger than that. Because that's where you actually have Hashem. The only way a creation can actually get a grip on Hashem, on the Creator, is by doing His will, or speaking His words, or thinking His thoughts.
If we do it because you want to do it, because the chance is running, then you can't lose the point. Not really, but
right. So here, he's not yet talking about the emotion that you use to do the mitzvah. Now he's just saying the fact of doing the act of the mitzvah. Later, he's going to get into why you need ahava v'yirah, why do you need the love and the fear. In addition to, he's going to get into all that. But now he's just saying the fact is that when you do a mitzvah, you have a greater advantage than when you use your sechel or your feelings to try to grasp Hashem. There's a certain advantage to it's funny that I used this book to do our Tanya class when we started 20 years ago. And I have all my notes on the side of the page, except what I was able to read 20 years ago. I can't read it. I have no idea what it says here. You need a magnifying glass, yeah. Useless. Useless notes. Can't read a thing. That's what he said. All right, take a magnifying glass. I'll be able to pencil. Anyway, okay, I'll get distracted. So the that essence of Hashem is enclosed in physical things, physical stuff in the world, which is what we do most of the mitzvahs with, or all the mitzvahs with, and their laws. Or the writing, the physical writing, the shape of a letter with ink on a book, on a parchment. Esrim v'arba sforim, 24 books of the Torah, of Tanakh. Today, in order to take kol machshavat tfisa behen, Hashem did that so that the intellect of the human being can understand them. The words of the Torah, even in speech and action, speech and action are lower spiritually than thought, right? Thought is the highest function of the human being. Even there, in your speech and in your act of the mitzvah, you grasp and you're enclosed in the thought in the thoughts and desires of Hashem, which are one with Him. By the way, any mitzvah, what was the bracha on lighting the Shabbat candles? Asher Kiddishanu b'mitzvotav. Why don't you say Asher Kiddishanu b'mitzvot? What's mitzvotav? Right. You say Shenatan lanu Torato Torat emet. His Torah. Why don't you say that He gave us the Torah of truth, Torat emet? Why Torato Torat emet? Because that's what He's saying here. He didn't just give us a Torah. He gave us His Torah. He didn't just give us mitzvahs. He gave us His will, His desires. How do you make me holy by giving me jobs to do that have nothing to do with you? If God gave us mitzvahs that have nothing to do with Him, it wouldn't make us holy. It would make us religious. Who wants to be religious? God gave us His mitzvahs. That's why it makes us holy. So when you say Asher Kiddishanu b'mitzvotav, He made us holy with His mitzvahs, what you're saying is the reason I become holy by doing what I'm about to do is because this is His mitzvah. This is His will. This is His desire. That's why it makes me holy. It's a mind-blowing chiddush. I mean, this is like makes the whole thing make sense. And now that we know that the Torah and its mitzvahs enclose, wrap up, surround all of the 10 functions of the nefesh, the kol all 613 parts of the body from the head to the toe. It's all bound up with God, the God of life, literally. The Or Havaya Mamash and the light of Hashem literally Makifa Umalbisha Meresh Vadragla surrounds it and encloses it from head to toe. Like David Amelach says in Tehillim, I take shelter in Hashem. Like a shield, I am wrapped in it. In other words, we're completely enveloped. How do you say enveloped in Hebrew? All of the above. Yeah. God's will and God's intellect, which are enclosed in the Torah. That's what I think we got up to there last week. So now, here's the interesting part. The Mishnah says in Pirkei Avot, we're about to read this here. It says, "Yafa sha'achat b'tshuva u'masim tovim be'olam hazeh mikol chayei ha'olam haba." Better to have one moment of teshuva and good deeds, masim tovim, in this world. That's better than the entire duration of the eternity in olam haba. That's what the Mishnah says. And then the Mishnah says, and you want to know how great is olam haba? I'll tell you how great olam haba is. One moment of pleasure in olam haba is greater than all of the pleasure you can have in an entire lifetime in an olam hazeh. So all of the pleasure you can have in a lifetime is not as great as one moment of pleasure in heaven, and one moment of pleasure in heaven is not as great as all of the life of the pleasure you can have in olam haba is not as great as one moment of teshuva and good deeds in this world. That's a very big statement, right? But how does it make sense? Huh? It's simple, but how does that make sense? How could that be? How could one moment of teshuva is greater than all of the pleasure of olam haba which is greater, infinitely greater than all the pleasure possible in Olam Hazeh. It's a big statement. What does it mean? So he says, "V'lachin amru." That's why it says in the Mishnah, "Yafa she'achaz b'tshuva ma'asim tovim b'olam hazeh mikol chai olam haba." Why? Ki olam haba. What is olam haba? Olam haba is, good question, I'm glad you asked, is when the soul of the tzaddikim pass away. When a tzaddik passes away, which means any of us who did mitzvahs, and the neshama makes it to Gan Eden, to Olam Haba, the world to come, the pleasure that the neshama has in Olam Haba is, to whatever extent you studied Torah and you did mitzvahs in this world, to that extent you experience the revelation of godliness, and your neshama has the pleasure of experiencing pure, untzimtzumed godliness. In Olam Haba, the neshama experiences godliness without any masks, without any veils, without any covers, without any tzimtzumim. That's the pleasure of Olam Haba. Yeah, because God is there without any cover, without any veil, without any disguise. God is present everywhere. Yeah, you will. Yes, you will. Olam Haba. Well, Olam Haba has two meanings, by the way. Olam Haba sometimes is referred to as the time of Mashiach, and also it's referred to as where the neshama goes after this life. So there are two different meanings. In this case, it means the life of the neshama after the physical life. So sometimes the neshama has to make a stop for a temporary, has to go to the dry cleaners first, but then it goes to Olam Haba. Every neshama. Yes. It's God without. In Olam Haba, you get to experience godliness without all of the covers and all of the mesachim that we experience God with in this world. How much do you experience? Depends on the level of your neshama and how many mitzvahs you did. That's your level of Gan Eden. That's why it says, the tzaddikim have the highest level in Gan Eden, and the average people are in middle level in Gan Eden. There are different levels in Gan Eden, different levels in Olam Haba, because it depends how much you accomplished with your neshama. But the point is that Olam Haba is where your neshama experiences the revelation of godliness, and it experiences godliness to the extent that it can. But how much can a neshama experience God? A neshama is still a created thing, and a created thing cannot completely comprehend the essence, the etzem, the truth of God. A created being cannot truly fathom its creator, even if it's spiritual. Yeah, even angels. And even if you did all the mitzvahs of the Torah, you're still a created being. You can't have God himself, because the neshama would melt in the presence of God himself. The neshama would just evaporate. God himself is too great for a. So how much could you possibly have of God himself in Olam Haba? The answer is, to whatever extent your neshama accomplishes purity and can receive godliness without the vessel, the kelim of a brain and sechel, human sechel, to that extent your neshama will grasp Hashem in Olam Haba. But that's very limited, because God is infinite and a neshama is not. So, ki Olam Haba, what is Olam Haba? It means shenehenin miziv hashchina. You have pleasure from the rays of the Shechina. That is the pleasure of grasping God. But what do you grasp when you grasp God? When you really have hasaga, when you can really comprehend God, what are you comprehending? You're comprehending ziv hashchina, not the Shechina itself, the ziv hashchina. You can't comprehend God himself. You can only comprehend the Zviv, which means a ray of light. The neshama, depending on its level, the higher the level, the more it will comprehend, but it's going to comprehend rays of light from godliness. It is impossible for any created being, even the highest kinds of created beings, like you said, the malachim and the whatever, lehasig, to really comprehend, just a ray of the light of Hashem, not God himself. Right. Even Moshe said to Hashem, let me see your face. And Hashem said, that can't be. That's why it's called a ray of the Shekhinah. But Hashem himself in all of his glory, the Zohar already told us, no seichel can comprehend that. So if no seichel can comprehend it, that includes the seichel of the neshama. That means that in Olam Haba, the great, awesome pleasure of Olam Haba that you get, that is greater than all the pleasure of this world, is only the pleasure of rays of light from godliness. Ki'im kasher tfiso mislabeshes b'teru of mitzvahs. The only time you can actually grasp God himself is when you're enclosed in, when you're wrapped up in the Torah and the mitzvahs. When you're actually doing the mitzvahs. Now you have God himself, because that is literally God's will. That's when your soul is grasping, is reaching, and is enclosed in HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself, literally, because it's enclosed in the Torah, which is Hashem. That's why one moment of doing an act of a mitzvah in this world is greater than Kol Chayei Olam Haba. It's greater than all of the life of the world to come, because the world to come is only a ray of God's light. Doing one moment of mitzvah is God himself, not some extension, a ray, an expression, a revelation. It's him. It's him. You have him in the act of a mitzvah. Now, now you're going to ask, it sounds nice, but the fact is, I'm taking a piece of leather and I'm wrapping it around my arm. That's God himself. It's a little bit of a stretch, no? I'm jumping into a pool of water. That's God himself. So he says, although the Torah and the mitzvahs are wrapped up, are enclosed in physical things, this is it's as if, imagine the analogy of giving the king a hug. You're hugging the king. There's no difference in how close you are or what kind of connection you have to the king. It doesn't matter if he's wearing just his shirt or if he's wearing the shirt and his jacket and his the cape that the kings wear. What's the difference if you're giving the king a hug? What's the difference if he's wearing two garments or if he's wearing one garment? You're still hugging the king. So it's enclosed. The king is wrapped up in a suit jacket also. So what? You're still hugging the king. You say, nah, I don't feel very close to him when I gave him that hug because he was wearing a winter coat. You just hug the king, right? Because no matter how many garments you're talking about, the body of the king is right there in those garments. The same is true if the king is hugging you with his arm. Even if it's enclosed, even if the king's arm is enclosed in his garments, like the verse says, with your right hand you hug me. That is the Torah that comes from God's right hand. That is the spiritual concept of Hashem's kindness, which is mayim, which is water. The actual thing starts up there and comes down here into physical thing. So when you're doing a mitzvah, two things are happening. When you do a mitzvah, and he's going to talk about this more in the next chapter, exactly what these two different things are. But when you do an act of a mitzvah, any mitzvah, no matter what level you're on, and no matter how much you understand it or how little you understand it, when you do an act of a mitzvah, two things are happening. You are hugging God, and God is hugging you. That's what happens when you do a mitzvah. Yes. Boom. Yeah. That is chapter 4.